So this is about kinematic chains. In these kinematic chains, suppose if you see upper limb and lower limb, first top one will be having shoulder joint, in the middle will be having elbow joint, at the end will be having wrist joint. So these are the joints. Here lower limb, hip joint, knee joint and ankle joint. So these are the joints we are having here. What it is kinematic change means, suppose if we are doing movement, suppose if we are doing movement in one joint, suppose if you do movement in one joint, if the movement is happening, if the movement is happening only in that joint, only in that joint, that movement is nothing but open movement. That movement is nothing but open movement. Suppose if we are doing one movement, suppose if we are doing one movement at knee joint, if you do movement at knee joint, this knee joint movement is creating movement in hip joint and ankle joint. Example I am saying, if we do movement in knee joint, suppose if this knee joint is going to create movement in hip joint and ankle joint, then we will tell it as a closed movement. Why mean this names means, now we'll see closed movement, closed chain movement, closed chain movement. Closed chain movement means, suppose if we do movement in knee joint, this movement, knee joint movement is going to create movement in hip joint and ankle joint. Then what it means, this knee joint is following a kind of chain, that is going to create movement in hip joint and knee joint. So that's why it is a closed chain, So here movement nothing but we know no kinematics, movements nothing but kinematics. So that closed kinematic chain. This is closed kinematic chain. Now we will see open kinematic chain. Open kinematic chain. In this, the movement is going to happen only on one joint. Only on one joint. It is not going to create movement in any joint. It is not going to create movement in any joint other than that joint. That means, suppose if we are moving elbow joint here, the movement will happen only in the elbow joint. It is not going to create movement in shoulder joint and wrist joint. So this is open kinematic chain movements. Okay, now we'll see why these closed kinematic movements will happen. Closed kinematic chain. Closed kinematic chain movements, why it happens? Suppose if you see, this is our pelvis. Here we'll be having lower limb. Here we'll be having lower limb. This floor. Okay, the pelvic. See here, this is our knee joint. The femur is contacted with the pelvis. Femur is connected with the pelvis. Upper ends of the lower limbs are connected to the pelvis. The lower ends of the lower limbs are connected to the floor. Be in the floor. Okay, lower ends will be in the floor. Whenever you do movements in these lower limbs, automatically it is going to provide the chain reactions, chain kinematic reactions. Pelvis will move, hip joint will move, knee joint will move, ankle joint will move. So this is the point about closed kinematic chains, where here closed kinematic chain, if one joint is moving, another joint also will move, this is closed kinematic chain. Example, see here, example, if the person is bending his knees in standing position, like flexion, so that automatically here hip joint will go for flexion, ankle joint also movement will happen, which movement will happen, dorsiflexion movement will happen, here hip joint flexion will happen. But here this person intention is to flex the knee. This is the example for closed kinematic chain. Movement in one joint is going to create movement in superior and inferior joint. This is closed kinematic chain. Open kinematic chain. Open kinematic chain means movement in one joint. Is not going to create any movement in other joints. Is nothing but open kinematic chain. One joint movement is not going to create movement in other joints. That is open kinematic chain. Suppose if you see here, if the person is flexing the knee here, he flexed only knee joint. Here hip joint is not involved, ankle joint is not involved. This is the example for the open kinematic chain. So same here also patient did closed kinematic chain. Here also patient did knee flexion. Open kinematic chain. Here also patient did knee flexion. But when patient is attempted to knee flexion in erect standing position, he did this movement in closed kinematic chain. Here patient can able to do the movement in open kinematic chain. Here only knee joint is involved, hip joint is not involved, ankle joint is not involved. So this is about open kinematic chain and closed kinematic chain movements. Okay. So now use what is the use of this open kinematic chain and closed kinematic chain movements? What is the use? Means suppose if injury happens, suppose if injury happen to one joint or structure, one joint or structure, usually that joint will affect either pain or a limited range of motion, whatever the things. Here if injury happens at one joint or structure, usually that joint and that structure will affect. Suppose if injury happen to one joint, it is going to show impact on the another joints also. Example, see, example, hip joint. Here this is hip joint, this is our knee joint, this is our ankle joint. If injury happen to the knee joint, whenever the patient is walking, that time he has to do knee flexion and extension. Here knee joint is injured. Because of this injury, here hip and ankle joints, hip and ankle joints will help to the knee joint like compensatory function. So that because of why it is going to help means because of this closed kinematic connection, it is going to help. So that kinematic chains, why we should read means we should understand the which joint is connected to the which joint kinematically. Okay, this is the purpose why we have to see the open kinematic chain and closed kinematic chain. Okay.